Years ago, when I was first getting into focus stacking, I refused to retouch, ever. If it needed retouching, I would just ignore that photo and concentrate on those that were more or less okay. Believe it or not, at that time I felt that focus stacking was already such an almighty inconvenience that I was damned if I would add insult to injury by having to fiddle with the finished stacked photo. After all, I was then a close-up photographer, and this focus stacking stuff was just something I was experimenting with, and pretty much a big nuisance at that. So that just tells you that I was on a learning curve. Now, the results of focus stacking did grab my attention, and ever so gradually I became addicted and was drawn into the long and sometimes painful process of stacking photos. Still, retouching stacked photos was not something that I warmed to easily, much less enjoyed. For one, I didn't have the patience, and at that time I still felt that if a photo needed retouching, then I had done something wrong. And this just shows you how little I understood about the mechanics of focus stacking. Like, there is no way to avoid retouching most stacked photos, ever, period. Anyway, I'm all grown up now, and I'm habituated to retouching just as I had to learn to enjoy stacking the photos in the first place. Things change, and even I do occasionally, but probably I change more slowly than average. That being said, let's talk a bit about the whole process of retouching stacked photos. Now, some of the focus stacking software is amazing at what it can do, considering that there's no human making real-time, on-the-spot decisions when they're needed. I checked out and purchased various focus stacking programs and finally settled on a program called Zerene Stacker as being, in my opinion, the very best of the lot. Now, there are many roads that lead to Rome, as they say, but we can't easily walk them all to the end, but we have to choose one. So at least for now, I'm walking with Zerene Stacker. Since I'm myself a systems programmer, I guess I'm allowed a professional opinion, and I must say that that Zerene Stacker is a wonderful piece of programming, and that Zerene Stacker's author, Rick Littlefield, has put together just a brilliant program, and its retouching features are almost ideal, and this is what I will be looking at in the next part of this video. The problem inherent in focus stacking is that because it's essentially a sampling technique like CDs and DVDs, etc., digitally, by definition, sampling samples parts of a whole and leaves the other parts out. And where the samples come together, there are always holes or gaps, and this naturally produces artifacts that may or may not blend well in the final photo. While most artifacts may be lost to even the vigilant eye, there usually are, or often are, stubborn artifacts that detract from the finished photograph, and I don't like them. The artifacts are not entirely random, and they can be kind of grouped into general types. Perhaps the most common type of artifact is what's called a halo, sometimes called a ghost, an artifact which manifests when a sharply defined edge of an object, like a leaf, is contrasted by the more distant background bokeh behind it. Remember that with focus stacking, we may want both the leaf and the background in focus, but where they overlap can be quite a physical distance from one another, and they just don't come together well. Along the edge of a leaf, a small dark halo appears that will catch our attention every time, and it can kind of spoil the photo. Another common artifact occurs when one object's detail overlaps another, but it is at a distance above or below it. This is really the same halo problem discussed above, but in a slightly different form. Trying to separate one overlapping detail from the other can sometimes be too difficult for the program, with the result that where these two intersect are some out-of-focus blurs that are not welcome. Most of the existing stacking programs offer more than one technique for getting results. Helicon Focus, one software, and Zerene Stacker, another, both offer two main ways to stack. However, in my experience, only Zerene Stacker's two techniques, they're radically different from one another, while Helicon Focus is pretty much the same thing. So in my experience, only Zerene Stacker can handle very fine overlapping hairs or bristles successfully, albeit by sacrificing a tiny bit of color exactness and sometimes increasing noise somewhat. Zerene Stacker offers two methods, one called DMAP and the other PMAX. These are their two stacking algorithms. DMAP is more or less what other stacking software on the market offer, and most programs do a decent job with this. However, PMAX, which is only in Zerene Stacker, is to my knowledge not offered by any other software, and it really shines at reproducing fine detail, and this is where, in my opinion, the other software falls down. As a macro photographer, I like to shoot bugs and animals and stuff, and like flies with hairs and all over their body, and these things just don't come out very well with many stacking software, but Zerene Stacker can do it easily. Anyway, although these two methods in Zerene Stacker can be seen as alternatives, choosing one method or another, it's your choice. But the best thing that I've found is to run them both and then combine the two into a single resulting photograph. And there is a particular order in how to combine them. Zerene Stacker has a choice to run both PMAX and DMAP together. This takes longer, of course, but it will produce the best results, and the flow is very simple. Let me go over it with you briefly. Now, we've taken our photographs, we've taken our stacks, we've been out in the field, now we're back in the studio, and we've downloaded our images onto our hard drive, and we've loaded them into whatever program we're using. Now, I like to use my raw images in Lightroom, and so that's what I'm going to use in this tutorial, but you do whatever you do, and that's fine. So the first thing to do is to highlight the entire stack of raw images in Lightroom, or whatever program you're using. In this particular stack, there are 90 separate layers. Next, we export these raw images to some directory that can be used with Zerene Stacker, and we load Zerene Stacker so that it's now operative on the computer. We export these 90 layers into the directory as TIFF files, and don't use JPEG or anything else. You need all the acuity and sharpness that you can get, and TIFF is not a lossy file format. It's just what you see is what you get. Anyway, you export TIFF files full size with no sharpening or anything else, just as they are. You're basically converting your raw images to TIFF files, and that's it. Now next, you copy or drag the images, which are now TIFF files, into the input file box of Zerene Stacker. It's very simple. You just drag them in, and there they are. Then you select the drop-down menu called Stack, and in that is an option called Align and Stack All, both, which means do both methods. This will automatically stack the entire series of images, doing the PMAX method first and the PMAP method second. Now, toward the end of the PMAP method, a slider will appear on your screen and ask for user input. You have to set the contrast threshold. Now, I usually set this pretty high, and you really should experiment, and I kind of experimented, but in this case, I'm going to set the threshold to about 90 or 91, and then I click OK. Now the program uses the threshold, goes through one last time, and removes a percentage of possible artifacts determined by how great a threshold of contrast that we set. When both files are complete, the two files will be listed in the lower left-hand side of the screen, as you can see here, with PMax on top and DMAP, the main one we're going to use, DMAP, underneath. Now we're ready to retouch. In order to begin retouching, we select the Edit drop-down button on the top of the screen, and we select Start Retouching. The program will then display DMAP on the right side of the screen. You have two images, right and left, and always the target is on the right, and the one that you're going to be retouching from is on the left. But anyway, DMAP should be on the right. That's the target for retouching, and we use that because the colors are always more true and there's less noise. We now click on the PMax output, which is in the lower left-hand side of the screen, and it will be displayed on the left. It'll show you two different views. One on the right is what we're going to be retouching to, and the one on the left we're going to pull stuff from if we need it. By enlarging, we can make this as large or small as we want. We can easily see that although the color is better on the right, that there are large areas on the right that don't have enough definition. But if we look at the corresponding PMax photo on the left, there is some detail there. So we can just copy over. We just paint in the missing area from the left to the right. Now I've only done part of the middle central area here just to give you an example so that we can move on. But you can see that there's already an improvement. One of the great features of Zerene Stacker is the fact that when you retouch the photo on the right, you can control the lighting to make it lighter or darker. In fact, I had a hand in helping this to happen and worked with the author of Zerene Stacker, Rick Littlefield, on this, although I'm sure he had planned to do it anyway. But the idea is that I like to shoot in low light, and a lot of my photos are so dark that I couldn't see to retouch. So he set it now so that you can lighten or darken it so you can see every little tiny blemish and thing. And boy, that is a huge help that I don't think is offered by any other software, but I could be wrong. So anyway, we fixed that one area, but I found another. Here's something else. Here's an overlap area that's neither one photo or the other. This is a more serious kind of artifact, and we solve this by selecting an individual layer from the stack that will correct this. In this case, I've chosen to pick that green leaf and paint it over the edge of the flower edge behind it. And by doing that, it took care of that artifact. Please remember, this is something that you're going to engrave in your memory when you actually start to retouch, is that this is, photos are impressions. This is an impression. You're going to change all kinds of stuff in order to make it look good. And if you think that that's not photography, then go take a photograph. But to me, all of this work that we're doing with focus stacking is creating an artistic impression. There is an art to photo stacking, and part of it's what we're talking about now. Anyway, when we're done fixing the whole photo, I won't bother doing that here. We can again use the Edit pull-down menu and select Commit Retouching. And as we can see, the resulting image is then much darker again, more like the original. So we're done with Zerene Stacker for this photo, and we're ready to look at the photo in Lightroom. So I just copy the finished retouched TIFF back into Lightroom along with the stack that it goes with, and then I look at it carefully. Now, one thing I can see that I couldn't fix very easily in Zerene Stackers is that the tip of one of the flowers, an important focal point, is for some reason blurry. So let's fix that. Now, to do that, I load the photo from Lightroom automatically into Photoshop. That's one of the wonderful things about Adobe, is that it's invisible. Moving from program to program and back saves me an enormous amount of headache. So anyway, in Photoshop, I zoom in on the flower tip. And using the clone tool, I just clean up that background. It only takes a second. I use a diffused brush for the background, but then I harden that brush to create the tip of the flower. Anyway, there, it looks fine. And now when I save it, it automatically goes back to Lightroom and is ready for general editing. Anyway, there you have the general idea as to what an average retouching session involves. Now, it takes time, and at first glance, the stacked image can make you want to just toss it out. I notice that I have to be in the right mood to retouch. You have to be willing to be patient. It's a wonderful and fun thing to do, but not if you don't feel like doing it. So I don't do it until I have that feeling, boy, I want to retouch this or something. So anyway, I wait for the moods. Otherwise, it can drive me crazy. Now, is it worth it? Well, we each have to decide that for ourselves. I've spent much more time retouching standard one-shot photos, so what's new? And one thing you do need to know, it's going to take you longer to retouch a photograph than to take the whole stack, often. So if you don't want to do that, then, as I keep telling people, focus stacking's not for you. Well, just a personal aside, it was for me because I'm very impatient. I'm a very fast mover. I do a lot of stuff in a day, but I needed to learn patience, and learning anything for me when it comes to like practicing, pretending, learning the habit of doing it is never any fun. So a fun way for me to learn patience has been to do focus stacking, and even more so to do retouching. Very painful, but very, very satisfying. So I try to put the things that I have to learn in life in some fun form so that I'm not going to hate doing it. And I've become a lot more patient through this whole practice. Anyway, focus stacking, actually, to me, all photography, as mentioned earlier, is impressionistic. That means it's a reflection of the mind of the photographer. Snapshots don't hold a lot of interest for me, unless they're just great snapshots. The arduous technique involved in stacking and retouching photos, as I mentioned, has taught me patience and attention to detail, both which are things that I need to have more of. So, rounding this up, focus stacking, it's not for the faint of heart. Anyway, you've been, I hope, warned. One thing to keep in mind is that raw images in particular are like negatives in the old film days. They need to be worked into a finished result. Now, I'm still learning my patience when it comes to finishing photos, and lots of times I don't do it very well. So there are lots of good tutorials online that will show you how to properly, step by step, go through and finish your images. But let me just say a few words for those who maybe know less than I do, and I don't know all that much about this. I do most of my editing in Lightroom, and I know they run it down and make fun of it, but I find it extremely easy to use. And what I can't do in Lightroom, such as cloning and stuff like that, I just pop the photograph into Photoshop and then do whatever little bit of work I have to do, and then pop it back into Lightroom and continue. I should say one other thing. I use a program from Nick's software called Color Effects 4. I know a lot of people, I know that Tom Hogan uses it. A lot of photographers use this program, and I can't say enough about it. It allows me to do things that I can't do in Lightroom and I can't do easily in Photoshop, and it only takes a few seconds. But the things that I do in Color Effects 4 is I use their filter for neutralizing whites, and I use their filter for removing color cast from the photo, and then I use their graduated neutral density filter, because in that filter I can move the filter around and bring out light in certain areas and darken other areas, and it makes a huge difference. Now your photo is ready just to develop in the normal way that you develop any raw image into the finished photo. Maybe I'll do another tutorial on that elsewhere, but this has been just an introduction to retouching stacked photos, and I hope this has been useful to you. And I'm going to put on a couple of links here there's some really nice retouching tutorials, videos that were done by Rick Littlefield that I'm giving you right here the URLs for. In fact, one of the stacks used here is a stack that I actually took the photos of that Rick showed me how to better retouch it. So these are definitely worth checking out. So here you go, and I hope this has been useful. Happy retouching.